Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 51st lesson of A Course in Miracles. And we are in for a treat, you guys. We are in for a treat. The 51st lesson of A Course in Miracles states, I am never upset for the reason I think. I'm never upset for the reason I think. This lesson is so applicable to the incredible work that today's guest does that I'm going to read the content of this lesson real quick. It says, I'm never upset for the reason I think because I am constantly trying to justify my thoughts. I am constantly trying to make them true. I make all things my enemies so that my anger is justified and my attacks are warranted. I have not realized how much I have misused everything I see by assigning this role to it. I have done this to defend a thought system that has hurt me and that I no longer want. I am willing to let it go. And today, everyone, we are joined by Father Nathan G. Castle, who is a Catholic priest of the semi-contemplative Dominican Order. And over the past 20 years, Father Nathan has helped at least 250 souls who died suddenly to adjust to the afterlife and cross over. These people come to him in his dreams, seeking help for resolving their interrupted death experiences. And although such contact with the other side was not something he sought out, Father Nathan has come to believe that providing such help is something the Holy Spirit has given him to do. He is the author of And Toto 2, The Wizard of Oz as a Spiritual Adventure, and Afterlife Interrupted, books 1 and 2, helping stuck souls cross over, where he has shared his incredible experiences while doing this very important work. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm happy to be with you and your audience.
Yes. There's so many things that I love about your books. There are so many things that I love about your core. And I'll just mention a couple of things before we get started into the stories. One of the quotes you said in the preface that I loved, you say, there is so much that we don't know or that we know imperfectly.
Mm-hmm.
That was beautiful, because even if we do know something, we know it imperfectly. And I just love the orientation that you come with in understanding, you know what, I don't know everything, and
Yeah.
so I love that. I love that. So what do you have to say about, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, when the first of the two Afterlife Interrupted books, my sister Catherine is also my publisher and editor. She owns her own publishing house, and she knows how to get first-time authors in print. And one of the ideas that I had was having a little inset in chapters, kind of like USA Today. There'll be an article, but then there's some little insert with some block of text or a chart or something. I wanted to put in an inset that said, I don't know, but here's what I think, and have that as a kind of a running, repeating thing throughout the book. And she was my editor, and she nixed it. She said, no, you're trying to establish yourself as an expert. You don't want to remind people all the time that you don't know. So, but that runs through the way that I think and live. It's just, I don't have that many certitudes. I have a few, but around mysterious things, I think it's good to sort out what you believe is true, what you know to be true, and then remember that that life evolves and there's always a deeper way to understand a thing.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to unlearn something you've already learned in order to
Yeah.
learn a deeper truth.
Yes. I completely agree. Um, so why don't you start out with the first story? I think the gentleman's name was Ray. Start out with the first story because I know you often say I was minding my own business.
Yes. Yeah. And I'll try to do that concisely because I've done it on a lot of different podcasts and shows and things. But in essence, I was minding my own business. I was asleep. It was right 3 o'clock in the morning. I live in Arizona, and I was a campus minister at Arizona State University. I directed the Newman Center there, was pastor, and I was on a retreat with some of my people in the mountains. And in the middle of the night, I was dreaming about finishing a round of golf with a priest friend and going into the bar. And in the bar, there was a silent auction going on. And I've run nonprofits most of my life, and so fundraising is always part of it. So I walked into this fundraiser art, thing, and on the wall there was this horrid piece of framed art. And I said to my companion, look at that god awful thing. Who would donate that to a charity? It was so horrible that I needed to get a better look at it, the way that we sometimes do when there's a crash on the highway. It's awful, but you want to look. And I looked closer, and as I moved toward it, it moved toward me. It was long before, this was like 25 years ago, long before we had televisions, flat screens on walls. But it was like that. It was, in fact, about the dimensions of a television screen. It moved at me, and inside, little movie began to play of a man burning to death on the engine of a car. He had not been in a wreck, but he was for some reason on fire, sitting on a radiator of a car from the late 50s, early 60s. And I woke up from it, and knew that the first part of the dream was my own psychobabble, and the second part was not. And I many times priests have to take turns keeping a pager on the nightstand in case there's an emergency call at a local hospital. And so when the pager goes off, you have to suddenly rouse yourself, and you have to pay attention to what the person at the nurse's station is telling you, the room number, the person's name, that kind of thing. It was like that. I had to spring to alertness, and I prayed to the man and said, I don't know who you are, but I'm Nathan, and this is what I just saw. And in the morning, we'll figure this out. But meanwhile, I'm gonna go back to sleep. And so in the morning, when you're on retreat, there's always some early risers that do their run or just like coffee and quiet in the morning. Anyway, there was a friend of mine on the retreat who I knew had spiritual gifts and had been a prayer partner of mine. So I just asked her, would you pray with me on this and see if we can learn what this is about and how we might help? And she happened to have a gift that I call prophecy. I travel in circles with a lot of people that are mediums and channelers and stuff, but in my Catholic church, both of those words upset people. So I don't use them to refer to myself or to my friend that I'm talking about. But it's allowing the voice to be borrowed for a godly purpose, to help someone. And this man moved. She asked, is it okay if I let him talk? We prayed maybe quiet for 3 or 4 minutes, and she said, whoever he is, he really wants to talk to you. And I said, would it be okay? And I said, yeah, it's all right. We would never do that without praying. I'm Roman Catholic, so the way that we do that might be particular to our tradition, but the principle is protecting yourself before you dive into spiritual realms. We use Saint Michael the Archangel, Holy Mary. She's very, very gently powerful. Saint Benedict. I have a whole host of saint and angel friends that I first asked to surround us, something like a huddle or a bubble. And so we did that. We protected ourselves, and then Ray spoke through her.
That's incredible, and it's so smart. And a lot of people who allow energies to come in for them to speak through do the same thing.
Yes.
Have some kind of protective measures. I think that is incredible. So in the story of Ray, I understand that he got into a fight with a friend.
He
Is that
did that.
correct?
He died angry at his best friend. He explained that he had gotten his girlfriend pregnant their senior year of high school. They married, and the baby was like a year and a half old. He went into a small business. He was living in rural Georgia and died in 1960. I was 4 years old at the time. Uh, but he and his friend was unmarried, but their habit was his wife would fix them Sunday dinner, and his friend was almost always there for Sunday dinner. Somehow they'd had too much to drink, and I think his friend made some sort of remark that sounded to Ray like insulting of his wife
Mm,
or something kind of sexual, or I don't know what it was, but it was something that caused these two men who were friends to get upset with one another and take it outside.
mm,
So they took it outside across the lawn to a detached garage, which was where their small auto repair business was located. And he was sitting on the radiator of this car in greasy clothes and somehow caught fire. And he says, I still don't know why or how, but he caught fire wearing greasy clothes and died that way.
wow. Wow. Um, I find it incredible that you intuitively knew that that was a visit and that that gentleman came to you for help. That a lot of people would have come up with a lot of conclusions after a dream like that, but you intuitively knew that he came to you for help.
It just seemed obvious to me. And it was I tried to just describe it, the difference between my dreamscape of a golf match and a charity, and then this other thing when it moved toward me, it and then a little film began to play inside this frame. I knew right away I was being given a message, and that it was so upsetting. The material was so upsetting, and the energy around it felt a lot of anxiety and anger.
So how were you and your prayer partner, were able to help Ray transition?
Well, we didn't really, we'd never done this before, so all we could do is use our common sense. I believed from the outset that I'm at the Lord's service. I dedicated my life to the Lord's service at 22 years old, and so I just it felt like, as I said, being called in the night, except not on the pager. It felt just like that, except it wasn't somebody at a nursing station calling it from a hospital. It was somebody in pain crying out. And so we just went into that mode and said, well, how can we help you? Wouldn't that be the first question you would ask?
Yes.
Well, how can we help? And the first words that he spoke were, who the hell does he think he is taking me just when my life's getting good? And by the way, we were told what by a gentle feminine voice said, be careful, this one has not yet chosen the kingdom. We weren't told, run away, danger, danger. We were just told, be careful. All right, that's fine. Oh, so we were careful. Um, but he wasn't there to harm us. He was angry at the way he died, and he had been taught that the reason that anyone dies is because God takes them,
Mm,
which that's commonplace. I've heard that before.
mhm,
Uh, but that it feels like a God then is like a body snatcher, that God didn't ask your permission to burn you to death in a fire. But then, so the image of God ends up being, very
yes.
violent and unfair. And anyway, he was responding to that. That was what he had in his imagination, that God took him. And who the hell does he think he is? And so that was the beginning. Um, we asked, well, what can we do to help you? And he said, my wife. Um, he kept watch over her for the 40 years after he died. He kept an eye on her, and he said she married up, she married again, she married up, she moved to South Carolina, married her a lawyer, They had no more children. That man did a fine job helping raise my son. I have no beef with him. But my wife's now dying of cancer, and I want to greet her when she comes, but I can't the way I am.
So even he knew that, he knew that he was in no condition emotionally, energetically to help to greet her.
Or any other way you can think of it, like in terms of like being barred or spatially, not being able to get where she'll be, or what he had done is choose isolation. He wasn't sent to a hell or anything. He just pretty much wanted to tell the whole universe, go away and leave me alone. He was just that angry. Most of your audience has probably had at least a moment in their life where they said something much like that. But I don't believe God and the universe allow that completely, because we're never utterly alone. We're embedded in a web of relationships, and one of them is with our guardian angel. Your listeners might call it a guiding spirit, or there's other language, but I just use guardian angel. And his guardian kind of sat at the edge of what he created in his imagination, and sat quietly waiting for the day when Ray would be ready to engage. And that day eventually arrived.
Yeah, that's comforting to know. What one thing that I did get from your books is, even in the afterlife, our free will is honored. And
Absolutely.
some people just don't want to be bothered, but they're still not left alone.
Right. And you can still make decisions in the afterlife that are not really for you good and for your good, even though you think they are. That doesn't go away. And so people have to gain wisdom, and they have to be willing to try new things. And remember, I haven't said this already in this interview. I've over the years, there've been more like 400. I think in the intro you used a 250. It's more like 400 now.
Wow.
But they're all people that died violent, sudden deaths. There's once in a great while I'll get somebody that something happened to them that kind of broke their spirit but didn't kill their body. And sometimes I'll get a few like that, but almost all of them are violent deaths. And so you could well understand where somebody that might have been healthy one minute and out of body the next might be angry, and that was certainly the case with Ray.
I know, Father, like you, our intention on this channel is for the healing of of everyone, whether they themselves in their thought process or the loved ones that they've lost, so that they won't think that they're in pain. It's my understanding that this is a small percentage of people who die, even a sudden violent death.
Yes.
Only a small percentage end up stuck. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I try to repeat that again and again, because for every person that does die a sudden violent death, they leave behind a multitude of loved ones that now grieve them. And I think most people move through their death, however it comes, with the assistance of their guardian. If you know about the near-death experience and the stories that people bring back from that, there's lots of companionship of deceased relatives, loved ones, sometimes religious figures, Jesus, for example. But there are some who get stuck and just need a little help, but they're not abandoned. They're accompanied to the degree that they'll permit help.
Father, tell us about like the rest of Ray's journey. I know that you had to get gut level honest with him and
Yeah.
say, listen, I think your part of your problem is your ego a little bit, and you may need to shape up a little bit if you want to help transition your wife. Let us know about that conversation.
Yeah, I told him right at the front that he said his wife's dying of cancer and he wants to greet her. And I said, okay, well, you died when I was 4 years old, and now I'm in my 40s. What have you done since you died? And he said, nothing other than watch his wife. And I said, you mean you haven't met anybody, gone anywhere? Nope. And I said, and now you're in a big hurry to suddenly jump up and run to wherever you need to go to be able to greet your wife. Is that it? And said, what you're asking us to do is to now hurry up after 40 years of not much. And I will honor that. But this is a little like counseling, and most people don't like being pushed. But you're asking me to push you, and I will push. But the minute that you think I'm pushing too hard, you can say no or go away. Um, but I'm going to honor your desire, and cancer has its own schedule. It's not going to slow down for you. So I'm going to try to push. And this was the only one out of all the 450 or however many it's been that took more than one session. We were still learning how to do what we were doing. So, and we were busy people. And any of your members of your audience that have spiritual experiences know that they also have to get to work. You know, you have to cook dinner. You got to do whatever your life has in front of you, and you don't just get to stop to do some spiritual thing because I couldn't. My life was way too busy for that. So we met a couple more times. It was only over about a 3 week period, and uh, over the course of it, we thought, well, let's. Doesn't it make sense, Ray, that you should sort of practice with somebody? That we ought to get you moving so that you can see that you can at least move around in the afterlife. He had mentioned that he learned about God because his mother made him kneel next to the bed and she beat him while he said his prayers. I thought, well, that just sounds like madness to me. I don't know what that's all about. What about your dad? Well, he died when I was 10. He died in the war. And I said, Vietnam? He said, "Oh, Korea." I said, all right, well, uh, he said, I was a little afraid of him. I didn't really know him very well. And I said, well, what if we asked him to come and be with you and you could kind of draw a line that he couldn't come across? You could have him stand at a distance where you could kind of size him up and decide whether you felt safe. And we did that. I said, sometimes I might go into somebody's office and stay near the door, or I might say, I'll only give you 5 minutes, limit it somehow. And said, do you think you could do that? And so we asked, he agreed. So we asked, I just said, God, would you please send Ray's dad if he's available? And he was there in 10 seconds time. I couldn't see him, but Ray could. He said, I looky there. And I said, what are you looking at? I can't see it. And he said, well, it's my dad. And I said, well, does he look scary? Or do you think you're being tricked? And he said, no, it's just my dad. And I had said earlier, can you think he had said he was scared of his dad, or kind of, he didn't know him very well. And, he was growing up with his dad off at war. It wasn't even in the household. So he didn't know him very well. And I said, well, do you guys ever have a really great time? When people go low, try to take them high. You know, can you think of the best time you and your dad ever had together? And he said, yeah, one time we went and looked at cars. And I said, all right, well, when he showed up, we said, well, why don't you let your dad show you around a bit, take you for a walk, do something. We'll check back with you in a few days. So we did that. When we got back in touch with him, we asked him right away, how did it go? You were with your dad. I said, what'd you guys do? And he said, well, we went and looked at cars. And I said, well, how'd you do that? You died in 1960. He died in the early 50s. It was now about 2000. I said, did you have to time travel? And he said, no, no, no. We went and looked at the new ones. So somewhere they were looking at new cars on a car lot somewhere. And just as an excuse to be together on a little guy date. And so after that, so we knew he could move around uh, and and that he could get over being stuck in one spot. That's when I told him, I said, I think I know what the problem is that's going to need to change, and I don't think you're going to like it. And he said, what? And I said, well, I just think every time you talk about your wife, you sound like a caveman. You act like you sound like you're the only person that should be there when she crosses because you think you're just the whole thing. And I said, remember, she's in her 60s. She hasn't seen you in 40 years. She's loved lots of other people, and you're probably not going to be the only one. You're the only dead husband, and you're the only person with which she ever had a child. You certainly belong in the inner circle. But can't you imagine that there might be a few people, maybe probably not a big surprise party for somebody that just died of cancer. I kind of hope If I die of a long, slow illness, maybe I get a chance to catch my breath or something in the afterlife before there's a surprise party in my honor. I just said, don't you think there'll be a few other people besides you? He said, well, maybe. He didn't like it. And I said, well, just be a gentleman. Just make yourself available. Trust that you probably aren't the only one and see how it goes. Well, then we did meet up with him a few days after that and said, hey, Ray, what's going on? And he said, big news, my wife passed. I said, oh, well, tell us all about that. And he said, well, it worked just like you said. I wasn't the only one. There was just a few of us. But he said, I got to be there. And he said, you would have been proud of me. I was a perfect gentleman. And I said, well, perfect, Ray. I knew you had it in you. You just needed to calm down a bit. And so I said, it's time for us to say goodbye, I guess, because you got places to be. You don't need to go sit in the corner where you were for 40 years. You got worlds to explore, I should think. And he said, yes, sir, I think I do. And I said, well, now that you've learned how to watch people and pay attention to when their death is coming and you know how to greet them, I wonder if you'd mind keeping an eye on me from time to time. And when it's my time to cross, would you be there to welcome me? And he said, why, sir, I would be most honored. Just look for the perfect gentleman. And so that's what we call his story, Ray, the perfect gentleman.
I love that, Father.
Isn't it a sweet story?
What I really love about what you and your prayer partners do is you give the souls a sense of purpose. Um, it's and because you're counseling now, that helping others is a huge part of our healing.
Yes, it
The
is.
way that you all have them, invite them to pray for you all, to just be partners in this is so healing. And we'll get into some of the stories where some of the souls were able to kind of redeem themselves by helping another soul. That's incredible that you invited him to be a part of your welcoming party.
I've been a campus minister most of my career, and campus ministry is largely a peer ministry where the older folk, the professionals, teach student leaders how to be the ministers to their peers. And it's not about, sometimes in the church people will say young people are the future of the church. Well, no, not exactly. They're already here. They're the present moment of the church, and they're growing into their gifts. But it's the same thing with the people in the afterlife. There's great dignity in being able to serve. And
Before you get into some of the other stories, because I want you to talk about your favorites, I wanted to ask you to kind of go into a little bit about your childhood. What I found fascinating was this work, Father, was always really a part of your purpose, even when you were a child.
yes,
The way that you were encouraged to pray for souls. Tell us a little bit about that.
yeah. I grew up in a Catholic household. In fact, I think, see if can you see that well?
Pull it back just a little bit. But yeah, back towards
Those
you.
are my aunts. They were both Dominican nuns. This picture
Wow.
was taken in about 1936 or so,
Yeah.
37. Um, they were first grade teachers. And they belong to the same order that I do, the Dominicans. And um, I was taught that when people die, uh, I was taught that like there were three categories: heaven, hell, and purgatory. And purgatory was in the middle. And that we didn't know, God had never told us the name of anybody who was absolutely in hell, that was God's business. And if anybody was in a hell, absolutely, God hasn't said who. So, but that most people would probably not go straight to heaven because that presumed a kind of likeness or perfection or something, and most people would be sort of in the middle. And and the way that it was taught to me was that some people would spend a little time there, or some would spend a lot of time there as they sorted through, they healed from or learned about, or sometimes it was kind of working off, almost like a prison sentence. That some call that karmic, a karma load or whatever. some idea that you needed to make amends that that needed to be done before you moved or ascended. Anyway, as a little child, I was just taught there was this place called purgatory that may as well have been Ecuador. The way it was described, it was like it might have been a nation state with borders, and uh, that's where you went when you left here,
Mhm.
and you stayed there for a time, and it wasn't bad. It was just something that you needed to do to get along, but that we could help the people there if we prayed for them and get them through faster. And I was taught that if yours was the prayer that moved somebody from purgatory into heaven, you would have a friend for all eternity. And so I imagined it like the lines at the bank. I'd never been to an amusement park, but in a bank lobby, those zigzaggedy little ropes tell you to stay in line and wait your turn. And I thought it must be kind of like that. So there's somebody, it's all the way at the front. And if only one more prayer was prayed for them, they'd move. And so I would do that when I was falling asleep. One of my aunts told me that she said, I need you to listen to me. It's very important. God loves everybody and listens to everybody's prayers, but the prayers of children go straight to God's heart. While you're a little child, your prayers are super powerful, but you won't be a child for very long. So don't waste your short childhood. Pray for everybody and everything you can think of while you're a child.
Wow.
And so I did that, and I fell asleep every night. And I would, once I was able to look at the newspaper, we got one in the morning and one at night when I was growing up, and they
Mhm.
both had obituary pages. So I would watch the obituaries, and I knew that only Catholics believed there was a purgatory, and Catholic people prayed for their loved ones, but the Baptists and the other Christians didn't even know there was one. And so I'd look for where the funeral was going to be, and if they were not Catholic, I'd pray for them. Uh, um, so to make sure that they got prayed for. I fall asleep doing this. It sounds exhausting, which is okay when you're trying to fall asleep anyway. But that was the way I kind of grew up.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. So after Ray, right? After the interaction with Ray, how did you and your prayer partners transition to understand that this was going to consistently happen? That
Well,
Ray
I didn't know
wasn't
until it did, but it started. They dreams of that kind again happening about once a week. I wish I had had the presence of mind to get a journal right away and start writing them all down, but I didn't. I just would write them on a scrap of paper that I didn't save, but I'd get with a partner, and not always the same one, because I learned that it didn't. I have the ability to allow my voice to be used in the way that my friend did with Ray, and mostly with her for a while, and then as things grew and evolved, there were other people that became prayer partners and helpers. Both of my sisters also have the same gift. So whenever I was with one of them, we might help somebody with a crossing. But and eventually I began writing them down in a journal. And now I had one last night about people that were dying in the collapse of a stadium somehow, a grandstand. Um, I don't know what that is because I haven't dealt with it yet, but last night there was a group of people that died watching a sporting event or something. Uh, anyway, I'll write it down, make an appointment with a prayer partner, and then it takes us about maybe 40 to 45 minutes per um, episode per person. Doesn't take very long. Now they've all been prepped in advance. They said I was directed to your line, like they really do stand in a line. Uh, and they when it's their turn, their guard I often ask for their guardian angel to speak first, just to clarify what I saw in the dream, because dreamscapes always have symbolism in it that you could misunderstand or that might be not completely clear. For example, somebody might have died in a car crash, but they didn't give me their gender, and that's helpful to know. Sometimes I feel like I'm not in the United States, I'm somewhere else, and that's helpful to know. Sometimes the scene can be like the beginning of a movie where you're in a crowd, maybe an airport or someplace where there are lots of people moving about, and you don't know who in this picture yet is the person that's going to be the 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 character in the story that you're going to follow. So sometimes, and then sometimes more than one person crosses at the same time,
Mhm.
and we'll ask about that. We'll ask the guardian, can you clue us in? We'll do it. And the guardians come through and use the voice first, and it sort of is like a microphone test. Can you hear me in the back? Is this thing working? It shows this soul that this is not difficult to do because they've just watched their guardian do it.
That was one of my questions. This is fascinating. This is fascinating. I was going to ask, of course, you all incorporate angels in a person's guardian angel, and sometimes they kind of break the ice, right?
They do
Yeah.
frequently, and most of the time that they even know anymore that this is sort of our method, and so they have a lot of other options about how to do this passage. But sometimes the guardian will say, "If you will trust me, I'll pick a way," and then they'll say, "There's this priest and his companions, and this is the way they do it. So be prepared. This is what they're going to ask you."
Mhm.
And so one of the things we frequently ask at the end is, can you think of anybody who died before you did, who loved you, that you would be happy to greet, and who you would trust to take you to the best place? We hardly ever have to ask that anymore because they've been prepped in advance. And really, this is very much like the discharge staff at some sort of medical facility. We're not the surgeons or the EMTs or anything. We're just helpful, like social workers or something at the end of the line saying, do you understand your meds? Do you know when your physical therapy appointment is? Do you have a ride home? Are you going to be well fed? We just are helping them kind of gather themselves and move on to a level that they don't need all this intensive care any longer. The healing has happened and now they're ready to move along.
And I've heard you say that it's kind of like your light is on, like they see your light. I've heard you also say that they are presented with a catalog of
It's very different. The lady, there's a woman named Wilhelmina who died in the 1950s, right about the time I was born, or when I was a little kid. And she said she used to catalog shop from the J.C. Penney and Sears catalogs. I remember those. They were really big and thick.
yeah, me too. Me too.
Uh, there'd be all the way at the back. There was a form to fill out that we put a long number in if you wanted that shirt or whatever it was, and they put it in the mail. Well, anyway, she catalog shopped, and so when it came time to do this crossing, she said they sat me down with a catalog and I just paged through it and looked at different ways that this could work. And when I turned a page and saw there was this Catholic priest, I said, "Oh, that looks interesting," because I was a Catholic. So that's the way she did it. Sometimes the guardian just say, "Would you just let me take care of this?" And then one time, a guide, when we asked, "How did you find us?" he said, "Well, your light was on." So I don't know how it all works. But we end up together. And they clearly have lots of other choices. There's no way in the world that I think the universe has only one of anything except God. Um, the universe just has plural forms of just about everything.
Yes, I love one of the things that I took note of is how you defy any kind of boundaries. You know, you just will not allow people to put you in a box, and just how I don't know how common or uncommon it is for a Catholic priest to do this work, but it's just I love how you are just standing in your truth.
And I'm not standing in defiance of anything or anyone.
Right. Absolutely.
I'm not trying to be one of a kind or unique in the universe. Or I mean, some of that's already built into us. Nobody has my fingerprints
It's
or
your
yours.
purpose. It's
Yeah,
your
yeah.
purpose.
I believe it is, and I'm just telling the truth. And I believe that people are helped. And my voice. That sometimes people are upset about the speaking through part,
Mhm.
and that they think it's dangerous to, you could be allowing some demon who's a trickster to come into you and so on. I just say, well, I never do this without first preparing myself and my prayer partners with spiritual protection. And I'm a follower of Jesus. It was dangerous to follow him on day one. He said so. Do you realize where I'm taking you? You know, you can turn back anytime you like.
Yes.
And
Yes. So, Father, let's go into some of your favorites. I have a couple favorites
All right,
I
you
wanted to talk about.
okay.
But did you want to talk about any of the stories, any of the
Well, I already mentioned Wilhelmina. She's a dear. She's a friend of mine, and she was one of the rare ones that did not die a violent death. I mentioned earlier that once in a while I get somebody that had their heart broken or some
Mhm,
tragedy that changed the course of their life and they kind of shut down. They died before they died.
mhm,
Sadly, most members of your audience probably know at least one person who has kind of given up on life before they died, and sometimes years before they died. And uh, and they always have a good reason. Uh, in her case, she was really enjoying retirement. She and her husband had a couple of children that were grown, and they'd married young, had their kids young, then grandkids and jobs. And she said, we hardly had any time as a couple that wasn't busy with living our lives. And then when we got unbusy at the end, she said we kind of surprised each other about how much we enjoyed each other's company. She said we didn't do much of anything except have breakfast and run errands. And she said most of the errands were doctor visits. And she said we watched TV and gardened, and she took care of the pet. She said our lives would have bored anybody but us, but we were just having a good time. And she happened to hate doing mending, but you know sometimes you got to do that. Mostly I send mine out because I'm no good at it. Even sewing a button on a shirt, just I make a mess. But she knew how to darn a sock or fix a little tear in a piece of cloth. Anyway, she said I'd do it about twice a year, and I just have to work myself into it and decide today's going to be mending day. And she said I took the drudgery out of it by making a game of it and talking to the torn clothing. And so I'd get my basket and I'd sit there and put the radio on and I'd say, you, Mr. Torn Sock, it's your turn. Today's your day. Any minute now, you're going to be good as new. So she went on like that, talking to the torn clothes. She was in the middle of doing that when her husband walked into the room, and she called his name, Eric, and she said he looked funny, and then he collapsed. And she screamed and went over to him, and she said, that phrase people say he was dead before he hit the floor? Well, he was. And she ran to the neighbors to get help, but there was nothing to be done. And then the house filled up with police and ambulance people and coroners or whatever. And she said, I wanted to rewind the whole day and not have it be this.
mm,
But then she said, I couldn't take it in. I couldn't take it in. But she said, I began to think, what should a woman do when her husband drops dead in the front room? She probably should go into his closet and pick out the clothes he'll be laid out in. She probably ought to call his former work and let them know he died. She probably ought to write something for the newspaper. But she did it all in the third person. She
mm,
detached from her life because it was too painful to live in it.
mhm,
And that's usually called dissociation.
mhm,
uh, and people can dissociate for lots of reasons. Even daydreaming is a mild way of dissociating when you're sitting at a traffic light and you forget that you're even there and somebody has to honk because you're not moving. You know, that's a very mild dissociative state. But sometimes people live uh, in psychological states where it's just too painful to live in their truth and their memory and their body, and so they have dissociative experiences. Anyway, she lived that way the rest of her life, and she said, I became an actress. I acted the role of what I thought other people wanted me to be. And she said it was so exhausting, but I didn't know how to be me anymore. And she said, I went to mass. I was Catholic, but I quit going to the coffee and donuts afterwards. I only went to the store long enough to buy milk and eggs and bread. I quit baking. I quit visiting with anybody. She said, my grandchildren only got to know this cranky, old, weird woman because I wasn't the person that I had been before. She said, my children took good care of the house and the bills, and they did put me in a nursing home when my health declined. She said, but I wouldn't have wanted to live with them anyway. And they did their duty. And and she said, I made it clear that I wanted to be left alone. So they gave me the oldest, sickest roommates, the ones that were asleep most of the time and who had no visitors. And then she died. And she said that was and she kind of lived on like that afterwards, just because she never made a different choice. She got in a rut. That's why I
Mhm.
call it stuck sometimes.
Mhm.
And sometimes, people just get so familiar with a pattern that they forget that they could do something else. And they're afraid to do something else, or it's too painful or something. So she stayed in that state in the afterlife for quite a long while, years and years, uh, not being punished, just not moving, or moving very, very slowly. And then she described that there were people around her that would engage her a little bit to the degree that she would allow. And she said, they worked with me slowly because slowly was all I would tolerate. And she got to a point where she thought, you know what, when I was in school as a girl, sometimes I was the slow kid. It depended on the subject. But if it was a subject I was smart at, I wasn't slow. And she began to get a sense that I could move faster or put forth more effort. She began to do a little bit of that. And then they began to bring around some visitors because she started to, and they were mostly children from girls, mostly girls that she knew in childhood. And they began to say, well, one of these days we're going to take you on a trip. We're after we leave here, we're going to go out to lunch, or we're going to, she said, one of these days we're going to take you with us. And so they kept trying to feed her imagination with the possibility of doing something but sitting around. And eventually, um, they, uh, they said to her, you know what, it doesn't just have to be girls' friends from school. It could be anybody, and you know who's waiting for you. And she said, well, I just didn't dare let him back in. It just seemed too painful. And they said to her, well, it's up to you, but you're keeping him waiting. And you know he wants to see you, and you know it's possible. Your heart got broken. And in this one, it was really sweet. Um, Mary, the mother of Jesus, showed up for her.
Oh, that is beautiful.
It was, and she was Catholic, and she said, well, uh, and she said she just appeared to me and was just there like a neighbor, and she said, uh, of course your heart got. Did she said first of all she said, did you know that I was a widow?
Um,
And she said, well, I never thought about it. And she said, well, the definition is you're a wife whose husband died, and that happened to me. And
oh,
she said, for a while my heart was so broken I didn't know how I would move forward, and but I did. And she said, and you will too, as you're ready. And then it turned out that in her sewing basket there was a heart-shaped pin cushion,
oh,
and the heart-shaped pin cushion had some of the batting coming out of it. Even the pin cushion had a tear in it. And it became kind of a totem. Mary said, your heart got broken, but it can be mended. And here's the needle and thread. I want you to mend it. And she said, I think, Wilhelmina said, uh, uh, she wasn't bossy, but she could be rather forceful. you know, and and I wasn't going to tell her no. And so she said, so she told me to just mend my heart, and so I did. And then her girlfriends came around and said, he's waiting for you. And she said, okay, at this time I think I'm ready. And and then he showed up at a distance. They often come from a distance so that they don't frighten you.
right.
You get to size them up. And said, here, oh, look at him. He's looking like the boy that took me out for a first date. And he's holding flowers from his mother's garden, and they don't match like the ones you buy at the store. Um, but he's got some flowers for me, and he just winked at me because that was something he used to do. And so we said, well, do you feel like safe to go with him? And she said, well, sure. And so they went just arm in arm and walked into the next part of her life.
So her husband showed up for her after all that time. That is
Looking like a teenager.
looking like it ready for a date. I
Yeah.
love
Yeah,
it. I
that was her
love it.
story.
I love it. So I would like to talk about Paul. I think that was the young man who drove his grandmother's car and
Yes.
had some friends, which was, I'm sure the guilt was devastating for him. But I want to talk about him.
Okay. Well, Paul showed us, I think that dream, I think it was an unusual one in that I think he communicated to me twice in the same night. Uh, I was driving an old, very sturdy, heavy car from the early 50s, and I I turned onto a dark side road through a forest, and then I could feel the rumble of wood underneath the tires and thought I was on a bridge, except it turned out to be a pier.
Mm,
And I was driving off the end of a pier. And once I realized that I was driving off the end, I was trying to somehow fly to the other end of the water and land on the other shore, but it couldn't, and landed in the water. And that's what had happened to Paul.
and for the listeners, what happens is when when you get the dreams, you're experiencing the moments before the death. You don't experience the actual, horror of it, but
They're kind to me. They buffer it. So they show me essentials. Sometimes, in this case, I was behind the wheel. Sometimes they have me sort of like, we see a lot of drone pictures anymore of
Mhm,
something floating above a scene. A
mhm,
lot of television ads now have drone footage in them. Sometimes I'm floating above a scene and I can see the cars collide, or uh, sometimes I'm in the back seat.
mhm.
Um, but this time I was behind the wheel, and it turned out that Paul and three of his friends had just graduated high school like a week or two before. They were in upstate New York, in a rural town in upstate New York. And it was sometime in the early 50s. And he had borrowed his grandmother's car because he was trustworthy. She let him borrow it because he was trustworthy. He was on, they were, it's kind of a double date, but he called his companion a gal pal. The two in the back were romantically inclined. They wanted a dark place to go parking. And so he accommodated them, and he said, I hadn't had anything to drink, but they wanted seclusion. And so I pulled off some place where we could sit in the woods. And and then he accidentally drove off the end of a pier. He said it was just so dark I couldn't tell, and all four of them died.
Wow.
He said he hung around and tried to attend the funerals, and he just said it was just so horrible um, that it was his fault that he and three other families were grieving somebody just as their lives were kind of getting started, and uh, so he called himself -4 man. He had read in high school The Scarlet Letter. Did you have to read that when you were in high school?
I was fortunate enough to have to not have to read it, but I know the story.
You got away with that. Well, I didn't. I remember reading The Scarlet Letter, and you know, uh, Hester Prynne has to wear an A because she had had sex outside of marriage and was an adulteress. Well,
Mm.
he remembered that, and he felt like he was -4 was printed on him, that he had stolen 4 lives from the earth.
Mm.
So in the afterlife, he was just this ball of guilt about that. So that's the way he was stuck. Even though it had been years and years since that had happened, he just persisted in that thinking.
Um, and that story was significant because I think later on he actually was able to experience himself as somebody who can be trusted to transport somebody again.
Yes, at the beginning of the second book, there was a man who had also died in a car. I think
I think it was Brady.
Brady. That's right.
Brady.
And
Right.
we had, we never tell these people's stories without their permission.
Yes.
It's rude right in the middle of their movement to say, "Stop! Don't leave yet, Loretta. I want to write a book." And it's they're busy doing a really important thing, and it's not the moment to be asking them about your book.
Right.
And so what we do is when it's time, we'll make a little list and kind of invite them into something like a waiting room and say, well, we only want a moment of your time to ask yes or no. May we use your story? And we'd be happy with either answer. But when we ask for the yes or no question, we often get an update because some of these people feel like a friend. You've been through something intimate with them. And so sometimes they give us an update. And in his case, he explained, well, the reason that the person who helped him, the prayer partner, was brand new at it. His name was John. It was his first time to ever assist in one of these. And John listened, and he said, well, you don't sound like -4 because you're all alone. It sounds like the others have passed just fine. And it sounds like they're more like +3 and you're -1. That he was imagining it as the crossing like an algebra problem. Do you remember those where there's an equal sign in the middle and there's something on one side and something on the other? And
Yes.
if you put 2x on this side and 2x on the other side, it cancels out and so on. Anyway, he was using algebra as an example and said, it sounds like you're -1. And then he said, what we really need how would you get the -1 to the other side of the equal sign? Well, wouldn't you put +1, -1, +1, and then +1 on the other side of the equal sign, and then it cancels out? And when he hit upon that, the guy said, I never thought of algebra as the solution to my problem. And he said, well, let's try it. And he said, wait just a minute, something's happening. And he said, it's my high school principal, Mr. Wambacher, and our colors were purple and gold, and he's got a purple and gold football jersey with a 1 on it, and he wants me to put it on.
Oh, I
Yeah.
love it.
So instead of being -4 or even -1, he put on a shirt from his high school football team that said he was number 1, and he crossed.
Yes. And that was genius for that prayer partner to use. Of course, we know that God's hand is in all of this, right? And so
Yeah.
the prayer partner that shows up for you is exactly the one that is needed to assist, in the healing process. And I just thought when I heard that, I thought, wow, that's really genius.
Well, it was, and it's funny because I've moved away. His name is John, and we have one of those relationships where if either one of us picked up the phone, we'd start all where we left off.
Yeah.
But we haven't been in touch with each other in several years now. I have a lot of relationships like that because I've moved so many times in my life. But yeah, he was a very quick study,
Yeah.
and in fact, Paul told us later. He said, since John did that for me, I hang around him now, and I try. And he said he has a little trouble with sadness and
Yeah.
depression, and so when I see that he's like that, I try to hang around to see if I can cheer him up.
And that when I heard that in the book, Father, it just reminded me how we are love.
Yes,
We are
absolutely.
love, and so Paul recognized that John gets sad every now and it's almost like he incorporated a friend who looks out for him. It's just beautiful.
And John's aware of that. I don't know, if he calls on Paul in prayer. And as a Catholic person, there was always room. Some Christian people might have been taught that prayer only involves God or Jesus or maybe the Holy Spirit. But and as a Catholic person, I've been taught to pray in the body of Christ. And in the body of Christ is everybody who is loved in the heart of God, and that means lots and lots of people. So I pray and invite my parents into my prayer. They both passed, and lots of other men. Even a couple of my prayer partners have since died. The one that helped with Ray, and Laura, my other prayer partner, they've passed. A lot of my friends have been older than I am
Uh,
over the course of my life, and so now it's almost 67. I have a lot of loving relations that have already gone on.
wow.
So when I pray, I have a whole slew of famous saints that lived centuries ago and people that I've known in this lifetime, and you know, they're all love.
I love it. That's right. They're all love. Anybody in the chat, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask a question if you want to. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, Father, is I know that some of the times when a spirit was speaking through you and your prayer partner was with you, and he or she would ask a deep question, and the prayer partner would say, I'm sorry, and the spirit, the soul would say, hold on, I need to go a little deeper.
It happens all the time.
And so what is that? Are they getting more in touch with your deeper feelings so that they can communicate that within themselves? What are they doing when they need to kind of pause?
I think your audience would appreciate they've been in conversations like that. You start casually with somebody, and if you're really paying attention to each other and you ask a personal question and you listen for the answer, people know that.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, people just say, "How are you?" and you say, "Fine," even though you're not. But
Mm-hmm.
then there are other times when it's clear that people are listening, and you might have just chatted for a little bit uh, casually, and then the topic or the tone shifts, and you're going to get more intimate with each other in
Mm-hmm.
speech. Uh, you sometimes pause, and you kind of calculate, do you really want to know? Or do you have time to hear it? Uh, it's like that. When there's an intimacy and more emotional content. And remember, I don't know these people,
Right,
so
right.
we have some getting to know you at the front end, and then when we move into the detail, that includes their violent death. They have to kind of catch their breath,
Yeah.
and they'll say, "Oh, let me take a minute." And then I've been told um, that each of us is an energy field, and that just as we have a specific fingerprint or maybe biometrics like those those things that read your eyes or something,
Yeah.
uh, uh, that we each have an energetic signature. And I've been told that sometimes to match me at a deeper level, they need to take a minute, study the up and down of my energy, and conform themselves to it somehow. I don't know. I I just know that it happens a lot, that we just need to take a pause to go deeper.
Yes, and I found that a lot of them preferred to speak through you, and I think a part of that is that you sounds like you naturally have like a southern, kind of tone to you.
I'm from Texas.
Yeah, and just a very open energy. So yeah, I found that
I just try to be at their service, and I appreciate that. It's short term. I'm helping them do an important but brief task,
Mm-hmm.
but I want to be at my best, and I want to help them move along. Sometimes at funerals, people who live hopefully about the afterlife will say, "Oh, Mama's going to be up there baking pies," or Dad's going to be bowling with his friends or whatever. And I believe that can be, because I believe the afterlife's got lots, and I don't think that's just silliness. I think that there are ways that everything that can be enjoyed here can be uh, approximated there
Mm-hmm.
or hereafter. Uh, but um, but that presumes freedom to choose and a kind of peace about oneself that some of these people that die violently just don't have yet. They need to regroup before they're ready to go bowling or bake pies or
Yeah.
whatever. They need to and sometimes, like Paul, they felt so guilty about taking the lives of other people that they feel like they don't deserve anything. And so they don't permit themselves to enjoy anything, and they're not left alone. And they work through whatever they need to work through
Mm-hmm.
at their own pace. For people that know the Christian scriptures, Jesus one time said, the sower sows and the reaper reaps. he's talking to some of his disciples and says, you're reaping what you have not sown.
Mm,
Others have come before you when you're coming into their gain. Um, and I feel like very often we hear references to processes that people have been through that were helpful and therapeutic, healing, and then we're at the far end. We're like at the reaping. You know, we're not having to do the heavy work. We did with Ray because he hadn't even gotten started really. But most of the time, the people that come to us are really pretty ready, and they don't need more than about a half an hour of our time.
wonderful, wonderful work. Wonderful work.
I think so.
Yes. And you enjoy it. I can tell.
I do, and I have to sometimes reiterate to people that it's not the only thing I do.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
live on a college campus of University of Arizona. I help out around here. I serve at several local churches. I do a lot of speaking. I do a lot of programs like yours.
Mhm.
I just was at the IANS, the International Association for Near Death Studies. I spoke
Mhm.
there, and
Mhm.
I'm getting to speak at the UN. How about that?
Nice. I love that.
Yeah, there's a group of chaplains, international interfaith chaplains at the UN in New York, and I'm going to fly to New York and talk to them. So I get to do this stuff, but I'm writing a book on the Gospel of John, and
Okay.
I just
Okay.
launched a podcast, and I do a fair amount of counseling. I try to tell people I'm a tow truck driver. I'll give you 1 hour long Zoom call, and I'll try to see if I can get you out of the ditch, but I'm not going to follow you down the road. I can't do, I don't have enough hours in the day to do that.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, can you stick around a little bit longer
Sure. Yeah.
with us? I just have a few more questions.
Yeah.
If you want Father Nathan's information, I'm going to put it in the description box. And please join us on the next video as we continue our conversation. Bye-bye.